Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos, and welcome to my guide to Assassination Rogue, Part 1, Mythic Plus Talents. So to start off, this is a default talent build that I think you can use if you're just going to watch, 2 minutes of this video, like some people do. This is a talent build that you can just take, import into your game, click these buttons, and you'll do fine with it. This is a great set of talents. I use it in most cases to pretty high success. There are, however, a few cases where I will change my talents. I won't basically ever change the first 3 rows here, so Elaborate Planning, Subterfuge, and Vigor. I'd use those in almost all cases, and in fact, I don't think I've changed any of those rows for any reason in Mythic Plus, this expansion so far. However, each of the other 4 rows, so Cheat Death, Iron Wire, Exsanguinate, and Crimson Tempest, I've changed all of those rows at least once this expansion, and I'm going to show you exactly how and why I would do that in the rest of this guide. So let's start off by looking at the level 60 talent row. That is Elusiveness versus Cheat Death. You basically never use Leeching Poison. Cheat Death is a passive that says if you would die, you don't. Very, very powerful. It can only happen once every 6 minutes, but still. The fact that you can survive mechanics that you have no business surviving, where you can make mistakes that you have no business living through, that's very good, particularly if you're not a skilled player like me and you keep taking damage that you shouldn't. Cheat Death is really going to save your butt all the time. Elusiveness, by contrast, is a very high skill capability. You need to be really, really sure that Elusiveness is the play before you should spec it, because Cheat Death is just so powerful. And there are a couple of cases where I do actually spec Elusiveness. Elusiveness is really good when the damage pattern is high, but predictable and consistent. So places like that are the 3rd boss of Temple. Huge damage, right? But you know exactly when it's going to be on you. And it happens throughout the whole fight, so you're going to get huge value from fainting every 15 seconds on the end of your beams that you're soaking. The other place like that is King's Rest. Both the first boss with Spit Gold and the 3rd boss with Severing Axe have a very similar thing where the damage is predictable on you, it's very high, it lasts for quite a long time, and it's not just going to one-shot you, right? That's where Cheat Death is good, against something that will one-shot you by surprise. But Elusiveness is really good against something that's going to do a ton of damage to you over a medium to long amount of time. Elusiveness will just reduce that damage by 30%, and 30% is a huge amount to reduce damage by. So those are the cases where I would use Elusiveness. The final case where you could consider using it is Bursting Week. And Bursting kind of makes the whole dungeon like those bosses I mentioned in Temple and King's Rest, where every couple of seconds, every 30 seconds or whatever, you're going to kill 5 or 10 mobs, and you're going to take a huge dot over the course of 5 seconds, and if you reduce the damage of that by 30%, that's great news. However, you really need to be sure before you click Elusiveness that you're not going to die to something that Cheat Death would have saved you from, otherwise your group is going to make a lot of fun of you, and that's bad, so be careful of that. Alright, so on to the level 75 talent tier. We have Internal Bleeding here against Iron Wire. Internal Bleeding adds a dot component to your kidney shot. The dot actually hits very hard. It hits harder than Envenom does per combo point, and it triggers your Venomous Wounds, which means that you get energy back as long as it's taking on a poisoned target. So that's very powerful. Whereas Iron Wire makes your Garrote's silence effect go from 3 seconds to 6 seconds, and it means that during that 6 seconds, the enemies are going to deal reduced damage. This is actually very good in most cases, because there's a lot of trash that does annoying casts. Most dungeons feature at least some mobs, but some dungeons feature a bunch of mobs that do casts that are really important to kick. And there are also a lot of dungeons where your tank is at their most vulnerable right when they're running in and starting a pull, and by reducing the incoming damage on them by 15% at the start of those pulls, when they're building up their defensive resources, when your Death Knight is building up their Bone Shield, when your Monk is putting up their Iron Skin Brews, that's very useful, and that gives your tank a lot of survivability. So Iron Wire, great utility in those situations. However, there is an affix that is active for every dungeon I do that makes me like Internal Bleeding under the right circumstances, and that is Infested. So Infested means that there are these spawns of Gahoon that you want to stun and you want to kill fast. Well, Internal Bleeding lets you do both of those things. So if your group lacks things like AoE stuns, I would heavily consider running Internal Bleeding, as long as it's not a dungeon where you think you're going to need the Iron Wire effect. Because at the end of the dungeons where I've run Internal Bleeding, I've looked at my spawn of Gahoon damage, and Internal Bleeding has done the most of all my abilities in those cases to those Gahoonies, because it's just so much damage and it fits perfectly in the time span where they're alive, and it means that you can just kidney one and kill the other and then go back to the one that you've kidneyed. That is just a great thing to do. It makes it way easier to deal with Infested. So I would absolutely recommend that for those situations, really, if your group doesn't have AoE stuns, because if your group does have AoE stuns, then you can just use those and you can focus your damage and globals on other stuff, and then you get to run Iron Wire. There are also, though, a few dungeons where even if my group didn't have AoE stuns, I would run Iron Wire for sure. Those dungeons are Motherlode, Temple, and Shrine, especially on Fortified. And the thing about all those dungeons is that they have mobs that are casters that are very important to silence, that do multiple casts, and that are dangerous. So Motherlode, I'm talking about Refreshment Vendors and the Earth Shapers. Both of those have a lot of casts that you need to interrupt that do a lot of damage, and getting extra silence duration on those is really great. The same thing in Temple with the mobs, the Incubators and the Tenders, and in Shrine with the Attendants and the various Apprentices and the Spiritualists. All of those casters really benefit from being silenced for longer. That lets them get into where you're pulling the rest of the mobs, because a 6-second silence is long enough for them to walk all the way there before they start casting and staying at range again. So yeah, those are the situations where I think that Iron Wire is mandatory. Otherwise, I think you should usually run Iron Wire as long as your group has AoE stuns, but you should consider Internal Bleeding if you do not. Okay, so we're on to the level 90 talent tier now. Here we have Toxic Blade versus Exsanguinate. Now, Toxic Blade and Exsanguinate are two similar abilities in that they are on a medium to long cooldown and they help you do damage, but they're actually very different in terms of how hard they are to use. Toxic Blade is extremely simple. You just press the button, it does damage, no need to worry about it. Exsanguinate, by contrast, very challenging. In order to get the full benefit from Exsanguinate, you really need to be thinking about your dots, you need to be tracking, the empowered status of your bleeds on things, and that is harder to do. It requires more brain power. And so if you're new to Assassination Rogue or you're new to these dungeons, if you're using your brain power on other stuff, you're really not going to lose much by using Toxic Blade over Exsanguinate, and I would recommend doing that if you're newer to the spec. However, Exsanguinate does have a much higher ceiling, particularly on single target, and especially if you can save your Vanish to line up with your Vendetta. So if you don't need to use your Vanish for skips or for resets or anything like that, and you get to have it on the opener every time, you're going to do great single target damage with Exsanguinate, especially when combined with Shrouded Suffocation. And Shrouded Suffocation is the trait that empowers your Garrote, and when you combine Shrouded Suffocation, Exsanguinate, and Vendetta, you just get a ton of damage in a very short window. So that is a great situation for that talent. However, Toxic Blade, not much worse than Exsanguinate, especially if you don't have Shrouded Suffocation traits. You're really not going to lose. Toxic Blade is even often better if you don't have any Shrouded Suffocation traits. And even if you do, you're not going to lose all that much damage, especially if you just have one trait. You can really get away with Toxic Blade, and you're not going to hurt your overall very much at all. Toxic Blade is also very good for Infested, because it kills Gahunis in a way that Exsanguinate does not. Assassination really suffers from not having a good button that it can just press to deal damage to stuff. All of the damage we do kind of requires setup. We're sort of like a melee warlock in that way. But Toxic Blade breaks that rule. It just, you don't need to have combo points. You don't need to have energy. Well, you do need a little bit of energy, but 20 is not very much at all. You can just press the button, you deal damage. It doesn't care if you have bleeds on the target. It doesn't care if you have dots on the target. It just does damage when you press the button, as long as it's off cooldown. It's not always off cooldown, but if Gahunis are about to die, you can save it, and you have a button that actually really helps kill them. That's very useful. And for similar reasons, it's good against Explosive, right? Because it's actually a button that your toolkit normally lacks that kind of button that you can just press to deal damage to something, and Toxic Blade gives you that button. Whereas Exsanguinate is pretty much the exact opposite of that, right? Exsanguinate requires setup. It requires you to work for Exsanguinate to be good, so it doesn't do anything against those sort of 4 to 6 second mobs that are high priority to kill. So if you're running Exsanguinate, you need to be sure that the rest of your group can handle things like Infested and Explosive. And then the final talent tier we're going to talk about is Poison Bomb versus Crimson Tempest. So this is the level 100 talent tier. This is the one where I actually see the most people select what I would not select. I almost always play Crimson Tempest. The only reason I would ever play Poison Bomb is if we need to kill a boss, and the thing that's holding us back from timing a key is whether or not we can defeat a boss. So that's very high tyrannical dungeons where there's a DPS check involved. Those dungeons are Temple of Sethralis, on the third boss, where we just are trying to kill it before our healer runs out of mana and or we die. Waycrest Manor, where Heartsbane Triad is literally a DPS check, right? If you get to 100 energy on those things, they're going to cast their Dark Ritual, and that's really, really bad news, so you need to kill them before that happens. So as we get to high Keystone levels, where we're just trying to eke out all the damage we can, Poison Bomb helps in those situations by a couple %, and Crimson Tempest does not. And then King's Rest. King's Rest does not have very many big pulls, where Crimson Tempest would shine. It just has the one in the second boss room. Other than that, Poison Bomb is not far behind on 3 to 5 targets, which is most of King's Rest. Most pulls in King's Rest are that size. And King's Rest features hard bosses and mini-bosses like Shadow of Zul. So in those cases, I would recommend considering Poison Bomb. Even non-tyrannical King's Rest, you could actually consider Poison Bomb on Fortified there. On Fortified Temple and Waycrest, I would probably still be running Crimson Tempest in most situations, though. The other situation where I would run Poison Bomb over Crimson Tempest is if I had multiple Scent of Blood relics, because Scent of Blood gives you an agility bonus for each Rupture that you have out. But if you spec into Crimson Tempest, you're going to replace Ruptures in your rotation with Crimson Tempests, so you're going to have fewer Ruptures out. So especially if you have multiple Scent of Blood traits, you're going to have a lot less agility over the course of a pull. So that's another case where Poison Bomb might actually make up the gap towards Crimson Tempest. But in all other cases, and I don't have Sent of Blood relics, so that's not something that happens for me. In all other cases, in almost every dungeon, you're going to see me running Crimson Tempest. It does so much more as you start adding more targets that it really makes up for the fact that it's not very useful on single target. You just don't have to worry. Don't press the button on single target. Just ignore it on single target. But Poison Bomb has been nerfed into the ground since Legion. It doesn't do very much on single target either. You're really not giving much up. So that's my choice for the level 100 tier. Thanks for watching part 1 of my Assassination Rogue guide. Remember to subscribe to my channel so that you'll get notified when future parts come out. Turn on your notifications too, so that you won't miss it. And then also you can watch my other WoW content, like my dungeon guides, my affix guides. Those have similar informative content, so if you found this video useful, you might find those ones useful too. Thank you, and I will see you for the next one.